In the village of Omoy, a woman's wealth was not measured by the gold in her purse, but by the shadow of the man who walked beside her. It was seen in the pride of a husband returning from the hunt and the security of a roof that no hand dared to pull down. But for Ebony, the only thing that filled her compound was the heavy silence of shame and the mocking whispers of those who saw her widowhood as a divine curse. That afternoon, Ebony sat on a low wooden stool behind her kitchen hut, sorting dry beans, her mind far away. From the front of the compound, the sharp piercing voices of her late husband's brothers floated through the air like the smell of a burnt offering. How long will we allow a dead plant to occupy fertile soil? Her brother-in-law's voice rang out, shaking the thatched roof. The sun has set on your brother's life many moons ago, yet this woman clings to his land as if her tears could make the crops grow. Is our lineage to be erased while she sits in a house she can no longer hold? Ebony's hand slipped, the sharp edge of a stone slicing deep into her palm. She watched the blood well up, crimson and thick, but she felt no pain. The pain in her heart had long eclipsed any injury her body could sustain. Her husband had been a good man, as steady as an Iroko tree, but in Omoy, a widow without a protector is a woman whose history is being erased before her very eyes. If you are watching this video, please like and subscribe to support the channel. Also, tell me in the comments section where you are watching my folktale story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The sun hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the dusty courtyard of Ebony's home. She sat in the silence that had become her only companion since her husband's passing, the rhythmic scraping of her stool against the earth the only sound in the stagnant air. But the piece was of fragile glass, and it shattered the moment the heavy gate groaned open. Her late husband's brothers, led by the eldest, Okoro, marched into the compound with the entitlement of kings reclaiming a conquered territory. Their faces were set like flint, devoid of the warmth they once showed when her husband's shadow still protected her. Ebony, Okoro's voice boomed, thick with a greed that no amount of mourning cloth could hide. The moon has turned many times since our brother was laid to rest. We have been patient, but the earth does not wait for a woman's tears to dry before it demands to be tilled. Ebony stood, her fingers trembling as she wiped them on her faded wrapper. The land is my husband's legacy, she whispered, her voice caught in the back of her throat. It is all I have to keep his name alive in this village. Okoro stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. A name cannot eat, and a name does not pay the village levies, he spat, his eyes roaming the compound with a calculating hunger. You are a widow with an empty hearth. You have no son to hold the machete, no strength to break the soil. To leave this land in your hands is to watch it turn to dust. By the next new moon, our kinsman will take over the harvest. You must find another roof, for this one no longer belongs to you. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. The suffocating cloud of her situation seemed to thicken, pressing the very breath from her lungs. She looked at their faces, men she had once cooked for, men who had called her sister, and saw only the sharp piercing coldness of predators. They were not just taking the soil, they were erasing her history, stripping away the last shred of her dignity until she was nothing more than a ghost haunting her own home. As they turned to leave, their laughter trailing behind them like a foul wind, a dark, cold madness began to creep into Ebony's heart. It was a desperation that did not scream, but whispered of impossible things. She looked toward the distant, dark line of the forbidden forest, where the ancient trees loomed like silent judges. If the world of men had turned its back on her, she would seek her survival in the world of shadows. The pure fear that had kept her small for so long was twisting into something else, a hunger that would lead her to the idol's feet, regardless of the price the gods might demand. The dew was still heavy on the elephant grass when Ebony tied her head tie with a final, trembling tug. The village of Omoy was just beginning to stir, the first plumes of cooking smoke rising like gray ghosts into the morning air, but Ebony was already a ghost among them. She carried no basket for the market, no hoe for the farm. Instead, she gripped a rusted machete, her knuckles white against the wooden hilt. She walked past the familiar boundaries of the yam patches, past the stream where women gathered to wash and gossip, until the path she had known since childhood simply surrendered to the wild. Before her loomed the menacing trees of the forbidden forest, a place where the sunlight seemed to die before it could touch the ground. The villagers called it the dumping ground for things feared, the final resting place of those taken by the swelling sickness and children considered abominations. Even the birds seemed to respect the silence of this place, their songs replaced by the unnatural stillness of a world that did not want to be found. Ebony took a step forward, the dry leaves crunching under her feet like breaking bones. The air grew cold, smelling of ozone and wet earth, a sharp contrast to the humid warmth of the village she was leaving behind. Thorns reached out like gnarled fingers, tearing at her patterned wrapper and drawing beads of blood from her arms, but she pushed through, driven by a desperation that is a madness. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drum in the hollow of her chest, yet she did not turn back. As she moved deeper into the thicket, the trees began to change, their trunks twisting into grotesque shapes that resembled the very ancient stone idol she sought. The path ended, completely now, swallowed by a carpet of thick moss and white chalk markings that shimmered in the gloom. Every rustle in the undergrowth felt like a spirit warning, every creak of a branch like a mocking whisper from the ancestors she was about to betray. Suddenly, the dense canopy broke into a small, terrifying clearing. In the center stood the shrine, a small terrifying hut made of mud and palm fronds. The idol sat at its entrance, its wooden face frozen in a grimace of eternal judgment. But it was the eyes that stopped Ebony's breath, two glowing, egg-like orbs of pure gold that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Behind the shrine, a giant pale snake stirred in the shadows, its scales shimmering like moonlight against the dark earth. Ebony stood at the forbidden threshold, her soul suspended between the life she was losing and the curse she was about to invite. The air inside the clearing was thick, tasting of ancient dust and ozone, as if a storm were brewing within the very soil. Ebony stood frozen, her eyes locked onto the two glowing orbs that sat within the hollow sockets of the stone idol. They were not merely gold, they were alive, pulsing with a rhythmic, amber light that seemed to sync with the frantic, heart-pounding thud in her own chest. To the villagers of Omoy, these were the eyes of the Watcher, the lenses through which the gods saw their deeds. To Ebony, they were her last chance to buy back her life. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice a brittle thread in the unnatural stillness of the forest. She reached out, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped her machete. The moment her skin brushed the cold, smooth surface of the first orb, a low hum vibrated through the ground, a sound that felt like a groan from the earth itself. The pure fear that had brought her here flared into a blinding heat, but the memory of Okoro's greedy face and the threat of her lineage being erased, pushed her forward. With a sharp, desperate tug, the first golden eye came free. The forest reacted instantly. A sudden, cold wind whipped through the clearing, snapping the dry palm fronds of the shrine's roof. Ebony didn't stop, she snatched the second orb, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. As the second eye left the stone socket, the idol's face seemed to transform, its carved grimace deepening into a look of eternal judgment. The glowing orbs in her hands felt unnervingly warm, like eggs freshly laid by a sun deity, radiating a light that stained her skin a sickly, divine yellow. Then, the silence returned, but it was heavier now, suffocating cloud that pressed against her ears. From the darkness behind the mud hut, a dry, sliding sound emerged. The giant pale snake, the guardian whose existence she had always dismissed as a grandmother's tale, began to uncoil. Its scales, white as bleached bone, caught the unnatural light of the stolen eyes. It did not hiss, it simply watched with its own lidless, yellow eyes, its massive body rippling through the dead leaves. Ebony did not wait to see the rest. She shoved the glowing orbs into her pouch, the sacrilege heavy against her hip, and turned to run. Her feet moved with the madness of the condemned, tearing through the thorns and the mist. She had the gold, but as she fled, she felt a terrifying weight settling over her soul. She had stolen the sight of the gods, and in the shadows of the forbidden forest, something ancient and sightless had just begun to follow her home. The heavy, thumping rhythm of Ebony's heart did not slow even as she crossed the threshold of her own home. The golden orbs sat in her pouch, burning against her hip like hot coals, their glow muffled by the thick fabric but their presence radiating through her very bones. She expected the sky to fall or the earth to swallow her whole, but for 3 days, the village remained eerily quiet. In fact, it seemed as if the gods were mocking her with a miracle. A stranger arrived on the 4th morning, a merchant from the distant coast, draped in silks the color of a bruised sunset. He did not ask for yams or oil, he walked straight to Ebony's gate as if led by an invisible thread. When she showed him the eggs, in the dim light of her kitchen, his eyes widened, reflecting the unnatural amber light. He did not haggle. He paid her in heavy pouches of silver and rare cowries, enough to buy the land, the house, and the silence of her in-laws 10 times over. "This is a king's ransom," the merchant whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "But remember, woman, gold that comes from the dark always carries the dark with it." Ebony ignored the chill that raced down her spine. She clutched the silver to her chest, feeling a surge of triumph that tasted like iron. When Okoro and the brothers-in-law returned to cast her out, she did not weep. She met them at the gate and threw a handful of silver at their feet. The mocking whispers died instantly, replaced by a greedy, stunned silence. For a moment, Ebony believed she had won. She believed she had outsmarted the eternal judgment of the forest. But the air in Omoy began to change. It grew thick and tense with expectation, as if the atmosphere itself were holding its breath before a scream. The birds, once loud in the mango trees, vanished. The goats in the compound refused to eat, standing huddled in the corners with their eyes rolled back in terror. Even the sun seemed pale, its warmth filtered through a suffocating cloud of gray mist that refused to lift. Ebony sat on her stool, her pockets full but her stomach churning. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had pried the sight from the idol, and noticed a faint, yellow stain on her skin that no amount of scrubbing could remove. That night, as she lay in her bed, she heard a sound that made her blood turn to ice. It was a dry, rhythmic sliding against the mud walls of her hut. The giant pale snake had not stayed in the forest. It had followed the light, and now, it was circling its debt. The following morning, the miracle began to rot. It started at the edge of the village, where the communal grazing lands met the forest. The sun rose, but its light was pale and sickly, struggling to pierce a suffocating cloud of mist that tasted of copper and old graves. A young boy's scream tore through the silence, a jagged sound that brought the elders running. In the center of the clearing, 3 of the village's finest bulls lay, stiff and cold. There was no mark of a leopard's claw, no blood spilled on the scorched grass. Their eyes were wide, fixed in an expression of absolute terror, and their bodies were drained of color, as if the very life force had been sucked out through their skin. Near the carcasses, a wide, rhythmic trail was pressed into the soft earth, a path of flattened grass and crushed stone that led straight toward the heart of the village. By midday, the serpent's shadow had stretched over Ebony's own compound. She stood by her kitchen hut, her hands clutching the silver coins in her pouch, but the metal no longer felt warm, it felt like jagged pieces of ice. A shadow, long and impossibly thick, glided across the mud walls. It moved with an unnatural stillness, silent as a thought, yet the weight of it made the very ground tremble. Ebony looked up and gasped, her breath catching in a throat tight with pure fear. There, coiled atop the thatched roof of her late husband's barn, was the guardian of the shrine. The giant pale snake was a nightmare made of scales the color of bleached bone. Its head was the size of a mortar, and its eyes, lidless and golden, seemed to be searching for the sight that had been stolen from its master. It did not strike, it simply waited, its massive body rippling in a slow, hypnotic circle that mirrored the way the village elders were now beginning to circle Ebony's gate. The mocking whispers had returned, but they were no longer about her poverty. They were hushed, terrified prayers. The village dogs had stopped barking, they cowered under granaries, whimpering as the predator's scent filled the air. Ebony realized then that the silver was a tether, and the lender had come to collect. Every time the serpent moved, the air grew colder, and the yellow stain on Ebony's hands began to glow with a faint, accusing light. She had brought a god's hunger into a world of men, and as the serpent's shadow fell over her doorstep, she knew that a stolen yam was beginning to bitter in her soul. The sun rose the next morning, but it brought no light, only a bruised, purple haze that clung to the earth. A horrific discovery awaited at the communal square, driving the final nail into the coffin of the village's peace. When the young maidens lowered their clay pots into the great ancestral well, they did not hear the splash of life-giving water. Instead, the rope came up heavy, and the liquid that slopped over the rims was thick, warm, and a terrifying, crimson and thick, red. The village well had turned to blood. Panic spread through Omoy like wildfire in the harmattan season. Women wailed, tearing at their hair, while the men stood in stunned silence, staring at the iron-scented gore that now filled their only source of life. "The gods are bleeding," a voice cried out, and the sound sent a shiver of pure fear through everyone who heard it. The crops in the nearby fields began to wither instantly, turning black as if scorched by an invisible flame. It was a suffocating cloud of doom that spared no one, but everyone knew where the center of the storm lay. Ebony watched from her doorway, her body trembling with a cold that no fire could warm. The calamity befalling the house had spilled over into the streets, and she could no longer hide behind her walls. The giant pale snake was no longer on her roof, it had moved to the center of the compound, coiled in a massive, shimmering heap that blocked the path to the shrine of her ancestors. Its golden eyes were fixed on her, glowing with a light that seemed to pulse in time with the heart-pounding fear in her chest. Everywhere she looked, the signs of her sacrilege were screaming. The yellow stain on her hands had spread to her wrists, a glowing brand of her theft. The silver coins she had hidden under her floorboards began to hum with a low, vibrating groan that shook the very foundation of her hut. By the time the sun reached its zenith, a grim procession was forming at the village square. The elders, their faces etched with eternal judgment, began to walk toward Ebony's gate. They did not carry gifts or greetings, they carried the weight of a village that was dying. Ebony realized with a sickening jolt that her plan born of pure fear had not just invited a curse, it had started a war between the living and the ancient ones. The time for mocking whispers was over, the time for the reckoning had arrived, and the price of the golden eyes was being written in the blood of her people. The crowd parted like a receding tide as a figure emerged from the suffocating cloud of dust and mist. It was Dibia Akim, the village seer, a man whose presence usually brought peace, but today he carried only the weight of eternal judgment. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his body adorned with white chalk and his eyes rimmed with charcoal. In his right hand, he gripped a staff topped with red feathers, the crimson plumes dancing in the stagnant air as if they were alive. He stopped at the entrance of Ebony's compound, the giant pale snake uncoiling slightly as he approached, its golden eyes reflecting the red of his staff. The villagers held their breath, the heavy silence of shame returning to the courtyard, but this time it was shared by all. Akim did not look at the elders, he did not look at the bloody well. His gaze was a spear, and it was aimed directly at Ebony, who stood trembling by her kitchen hut. "The earth is screaming." Akim's voice suddenly erupted, a seer's roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The ancestors turn their backs, and the guardian of the shrine walks among the living because a hand has reached into the sacred dark and plucked out the sight of the gods. He raised his staff, the red feathers pointing like an accusing finger at Ebony. "Ebony, daughter of Omoy, you have traded the village's life for a stolen dream. You have brought the wealth of the dead into the world of the living, and now the lender has come to collect his debt." Ebony felt the silver coins in her pouch grow impossibly heavy, as if they were turning back into the stone from which they had been forged. The yellow stain on her hands pulsed with a blinding, rhythmic light, exposing her sacrilege for all to see. "I only wanted to stay in my home," she whispered, her voice a fragile plea against the power of his roar. "A home built on a theft from the gods is no home at all, it is a grave," Akim retorted, his eyes flashing with a terrifying clarity. The well runs with blood because the idol is blind. The livestock die because the guardian is hungry. There is a thief in our midst, and the price of her greed is the soul of this village. The elders gasped, their faces hardening into masks of sharp piercing anger. Okoro, who had so recently clutched her silver, now spat on the ground in disgust. Ebony stood alone, her life finally crumbling around her feet. The seer's staff hit the ground with a thundering crack, and the giant snake let out a low, vibrating hiss that vibrated through her marrow. The madness of her desperation had led her here, and now, under the weight of the seer's gaze, she realized that to save herself, she had truly destroyed everything. The air in the courtyard grew cold, a suffocating cloud of divine wrath that seemed to drain the color from the very trees. Dibia Akim stood immovable, his eyes like burning coals as he struck his staff against the earth. Each thud resonated not in the ground, but in the hollow space of Ebony's chest. The villagers had retreated to the walls of the compound, their faces masks of sharp piercing terror and betrayal. Even Okoro, usually so loud in his greed, looked small and withered under the gaze of the sightless gods. The idol is blind, Ebony, Akim's voice dropped to a low, vibrating growl that carried the weight of the forest. And because he cannot see, he reaches out in the dark. He has taken the water, he has taken the cattle, and now he reaches for the heartbeat of Omoy itself. A covenant has been broken, and the law of the ancestors is clear, a life for a life. The deity demands the head of the one who stole his vision. Ebony felt her knees give way. She collapsed into the dust, the pouches of silver at her waist clinking with a sound that now mocked her. The pure fear she had felt in the forest was nothing compared to the absolute desolation that now consumed her. She looked at her hands, the yellow stain had turned a deep, bruised purple, glowing with an angry light that marked her as a sacrifice. Her life finally crumbled, leaving her naked before the judgment of the living and the dead. Please, she sobbed, her forehead pressing into the dirt. I only wanted to survive. I only wanted to keep the roof my husband built for me. You built a palace of gold upon a foundation of sacrilege, Akim retorted, stepping closer. The giant pale snake uncoiled behind him, its massive white head looming over the Dibia's shoulder. Its golden eyes were fixed on Ebony, its tongue flickering like a flame. The serpent does not hiss for mercy. It hisses for the debt. Either you return to the forest and offer your soul to the one you robbed, or the blood in the well will be followed by the blood of every child in this village. Ebony looked up and saw the faces of her neighbors, women she had shared salt with, children she had watched play. In their eyes, she saw the heavy silence of shame replaced by a desperate, murderous hunger for their own survival. She realized then that there was no miracle left to save her. To stay was to bring total annihilation, to go was to face a terror beyond human understanding. The madness was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She had stolen the eyes of a god, and now she would have to look into the face of death to return them. Her lineage would not be erased by her in-laws, but by her own hands. Slowly, she reached into her pouch and felt the cold, vibrating weight of the golden eyes, knowing that her walk into the mist would be her last. The walk back to the forbidden forest was a journey through a world that had already begun to dissolve. Ebony moved like a sleepwalker, her feet finding the path not by sight, but by the heavy, magnetic pull of the sacrilege she carried in her pouch. Behind her, the village of Omoy was silent, the suffocating cloud of the curse hanging so low that the thatched roof seemed to groan under its weight. She did not look back. She knew that if she saw the bloody well or the hollow eyes of her neighbors one more time, her pure fear would turn into a paralysis that would claim them all. As she crossed the forbidden threshold, the forest did not resist her. The thorns that had once torn her skin now pulled aside like heavy curtains, and the menacing trees seemed to lean in, whispering in a language of creaks and sighs. The unnatural stillness was absolute. Even the giant pale snake that had haunted her compound was gone, its presence felt only as a cold, vibrating energy in the mist ahead. Ebony reached the clearing of the shrine, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The stone idol sat in the gloom, its empty socket staring at her with an eternal judgment that felt heavier than any mountain. With trembling hands, she reached into her pouch and withdrew the golden eyes. They no longer glowed with the miracle light of wealth, they pulsed with a dark, angry heat that scorched her palms. "I have brought them back," she whispered, her voice cracking in the hollow air. "I stole the sight of the gods to save a house of clay, but I have learned that a stolen yam only brings the hunger of the grave. Take the gold. Take the debt. Let the village live." She stepped forward and placed the orbs back into the sightless sockets of the stone face. The moment the gold touched the stone, a sound like a great indrawn breath rushed through the forest. A thick, white mist, brighter and purer than the gloom, erupted from the shrine, swallowing the gold and the idol in a blinding shroud. Ebony fell to her knees, shielding her eyes as the serpent's shadow swept past her one last time, a rush of cold air that smelled of ancient rain and damp earth. When she finally looked up, the clearing was empty. The snake was gone. The idol sat in the shadows, its eyes no longer glowing, but restored to a quiet, stony peace. The yellow stain on Ebony's hands had vanished, leaving her skin pale and humbled. She walked out of the forest as the first rays of a true sun broke through the canopy, the suffocating cloud over Omoy finally lifting. She returned to her empty house with nothing, no silver, no land, no protector, but as she sat on her low wooden stool, she felt a peace that gold could never buy. The gods were terrible, yes, but they had left her alive, and for a woman who had looked into the eyes of death, that was miracle enough. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. We wish you and your family strength, a life full of joy and peace every day. See you again in the next video.